January 5, 1943. South Pacific waters off Guadalcanal. The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck of the cruiser USS Helena. The Pacific War had reached a brutal intensity, and every sailor knew that death could arrive from the sky at any moment. The Helena was on high alert, withdrawing southward after bombarding Japanese positions at Munda Airfield on New Georgia. Bitter experience had taught them that swift and deadly Japanese retaliation often followed such raids. Four Japanese dive bombers, older IED-3A aircraft sent valves by Allied forces, soon appeared on the horizon. Though slower than newer designs, their accuracy made them deadly. The alarm sounded and gun crews scrambled to battle stations. The planes dove, their bombs finding their mark on HMNZ's Achilles before beginning their withdrawal. What happened next would change warfare forever as the Japanese bombers climbed away, thinking they had escaped the range of American guns. Helena's 5 and 38 caliber guns opened fire, not with a desperate barrage but with just a few shells. The gun crews watched as the projectiles streaked toward the distant aircraft, now over 4 miles away. Then something extraordinary occurred. The shells exploded near the planes without hitting them directly. One bomber erupted in flames and tumbled into the ocean. Another followed moments later. The shells had exploded automatically when they came close enough to the targets. There were no timing calculations, no frantic adjustments of fuse settings, and no guesswork. The weapons simply knew when to detonate. Commander W.S. Parsons, who documented the engagement, noted that these were not lucky shots. These were precision kills achieved by a weapon that detected its own proximity to the target and detonated at exactly the right moment to maximize damage. The sailors had just used a secret so closely guarded that it ranked second only to the atomic bomb project in security classification. It was a device that would prove 3 to 4 times more effective than conventional ammunition. Yet despite its incredible potential to save American lives, the highest levels of military command would refuse to authorize its widespread use for nearly 2 years. This is the story of the proximity fuse. Before 1943, shooting down an aircraft with anti-aircraft artillery was an exercise in deadly futility. The problem was simple. Aircraft are small, fast, and move in 3 dimensions, while artillery shells follow a predetermined ballistic path. Traditional anti-aircraft guns relied on 2 types of fuses with severe limitations. Contact fuses required a direct hit on a fast-moving object, a mathematical probability that was vanishingly small. Time fuses exploded at a specific moment after firing. Gun crews had to calculate the exact moment the shell would be nearest the aircraft, accounting for speed, altitude, wind, and trajectory. Any error, even a fraction of a second, meant the shell exploded harmlessly in empty air. The early war statistics were grim. At the start of the war in Europe, it took an estimated 20,000 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition to shoot down a single enemy aircraft. Some estimates suggested figures as high as 100,000 rounds per kill. Naval vessels and ground installations expended enormous quantities of ammunition with little to show for it. At Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea and Midway American sailors died because their anti-aircraft guns could not reliably stop attacking aircraft. Scientists and military planners across all warring nations knew there had to be a better solution. The concept of a proximity fuse, a shell that could detect its target and detonate automatically at the optimal distance for maximum damage, had been discussed for decades. The British began preliminary research in 1939. The Germans initiated at least 30 different proximity fuse programs. The Japanese experimented with acoustic and magnetic detection systems. Everyone recognized the transformative potential. However, recognizing potential and creating a functional weapon were distinct challenges. The technical obstacles seemed insurmountable with 1940s technology. The Germans, despite extensive research into acoustic, radio, and electrostatic fuses, had their programs halted in 1940 by direct order from Hitler, who demanded all research focus on projects that could reach production within 6 months. This decision, driven by overconfidence, proved catastrophic. When German research resumed in 1944, it was too late. The Japanese understood the concept but lacked the industrial infrastructure for miniaturized electronics. Their vacuum tubes were larger, less reliable, and could not withstand the stresses involved. A proximity fuse would need to contain a miniature radar system capable of detecting aircraft and calculating distance in real time. This entire system had to fit inside an artillery shell, only 5 in diameter. The components would need to survive acceleration forces of 20,000 times gravity when fired from a naval gun. The shell would spin at 25,000 revolutions per minute. Most experts considered it impossible with existing technology. Vacuum tubes, the basic building blocks of all electronic circuits, were delicate glass containers that shattered under far less stress. The British shared their early research with American scientists in September 1940 through the Tizard mission. Sir Henry Tizard brought preliminary designs and reports on failed experiments, but British scientists admitted they lacked the industrial capacity and specialized knowledge in miniaturized electronics to turn theory into mass-produced reality. The challenge fell to American researchers. The National Defense Research Committee assigned the project to Dr. Merle Cube at the Applied Physics Laboratory of Johns Hopkins University. Two assembled a team that worked under conditions of absolute secrecy that rivaled the Manhattan Project. The fuse was given the intentionally vague code name Variable Time, abbreviated VT, to hide its true nature. The team faced one technical crisis after another. Standard vacuum tubes shattered instantly under the massive acceleration forces. In one test, engineers fired a standard radio tube and recovered only glass powder. The breakthrough came through a partnership with Sylvania Electric Products. Working with Section T engineers, Sylvania developed special miniaturized tubes with reinforced glass, multiple support structures, and shock-resistant internal components. They started with hearing aid tubes and modified them extensively, adding glass supports, shortening lead wires, and replacing standard materials. However, even these improved tubes failed repeatedly. The solution came from Dr. James Van Allen, a young physicist on the team who would later discover the Van Allen radiation belts. He suggested using a wax and oil combination in precise ratios with the tubes mounted at specific angles. After thousands of configurations, they found the tubes mounted at a 30 degrees angle to the shell's axis, cushioned in a mixture of sarin wax and transformer oil, could survive about 70% of test firings. This was deemed acceptable for wartime production. The battery problem was solved with an ingenious and counterintuitive design. Engineers created a tiny glass ampule containing liquid electrolyte that sat inert until the shell was fired. When the gun fired, the massive acceleration shattered the glass, and centrifugal force from the shell's spin drove the liquid outward to contact metal plates. This initiated a chemical reaction that generated electrical current. The battery literally activated itself through the very forces that threatened to destroy it. The radar system required innovations to fit in a space the size of an ice cream cone. The transmitter and receiver had to share a single tiny antenna. Section T engineers developed an ingenious autodyne detector circuit that could sense minute changes in signal strength as the shell approached its target. When the reflected signal exceeded a specific threshold, the firing circuit would trigger the detonation. But proximity detection alone was not enough. The fuse had to avoid false triggers from ocean waves or rain. Engineers added sophisticated wave suppression circuits that ignored long-duration signals from stationary surfaces while remaining sensitive to the characteristic reflections from moving aircraft. They built in time delays so the fuse could not arm until the shell had traveled safely away from the firing ship, typically 700 wide from the gun. Multiple independent safety systems had to align perfectly before the weapon became dangerous. The first successful test came on August 12, 1942, aboard the USS Cleveland. Gunners shot down 3 radio-controlled drone aircraft with just 4 bursts on the first day. The test was so successful that the Navy canceled the planned second day of testing and immediately ordered mass production. Production of the Mark 32 VT fuse began in November 1942. The Pacific Fleet received 4,500 fuses by the end of the year, distributed only to select cruisers and battleships. Navy security protocols were extraordinary. VT fuse shells could only be fired over deep water where the depth exceeded 100 fathoms. Any dud that failed to detonate would sink beyond enemy reach. Ships received strict orders never to use the fuses where they might fall on land or in shallow water. The technology was too valuable to risk any possibility of capture. In early January 1943, the Helena put the new fuses to their first real combat test. The results exceeded all expectations. The ship's gunners fired only 22 rounds and achieved 2 confirmed kills at ranges previously thought impossible. A gunnery report stated, "The value of the Mark 32 fused projectile cannot be too highly stressed." Throughout 1943, VT fused ammunition proved itself in battle. During that year, naval guns fired 36,370 anti-aircraft rounds. Although only 25% used proximity fuses, these shells accounted for 51% of all aircraft destroyed. Time-fused shells required an average of 508 rounds to destroy one aircraft, while proximity fused shells required only 155 rounds per kill. The new technology was more than 3 times as effective as conventional ammunition. A proximity fused shell created a lethal kill zone of 3,000 square ft, compared to 60 square ft for a perfectly timed conventional shell. The effective target area had become 50 times larger. Night kill ratios increased by 370% when ships used VT ammunition. Admiral William Halsey recognized the strategic implications immediately. Japanese torpedo planes had been making devastating nighttime attacks protected by darkness. With proximity fuses and radar-controlled gun directors, that advantage evaporated overnight. The tactics that had terrorized the fleet became suicide missions. Yet as Navy ships reaped these benefits, Army commanders in Europe fought with one hand tied behind their backs. General Dwight Eisenhower had seen the statistics, but was refused permission to use the fuse. The Pentagon's logic was based on legitimate security concerns. Every artillery shell fired over land carried the risk of falling into German hands if it failed to detonate. If the Germans captured even one intact fuse and successfully reverse-engineered it, the consequences for the American and British strategic bombing campaign could be catastrophic. German flak batteries could become 3 to 4 times more effective, potentially losing the air war over Europe. The Pentagon maintained its embargo through most of 1944. The Navy could use proximity fuses over deep water. The Army could not use them in Europe. This decision had devastating consequences measured in American blood. Time-fused artillery continued to require thousands of rounds for meaningful results. American soldiers died while the weapon that could save them sat in warehouses. The military situation grew more desperate by late 1944. German forces had stabilized their lines and were preparing a massive counteroffensive. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched its surprise offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. American artillery fought desperately, but time-fused shells proved woefully inadequate against infantry advancing across snow-covered open ground. Too many shells buried themselves in the soft earth, detonating harmlessly underground. 3 days into the German offensive, Eisenhower had seen enough. He sent an urgent message to the Pentagon demanding immediate authorization to use proximity fuses in ground artillery. He argued that the risk of captured fuses was less than the risk of losing the entire campaign. The Pentagon relented with remarkable speed. On December 21, 1944, all restrictions were removed. 200,000 shells with VT fuses centimes were rushed to the front lines. The results were immediate and devastating. American artillery, which had been marginally effective, suddenly became a precision killing machine. Shells exploded perfectly at treetop height without requiring any time fuse calculations. Every round detonated at the optimal height to spray fragments across the maximum area. German soldiers advancing across snow-covered fields found themselves in kill zones with no protection. The bad weather that was supposed to protect them made no difference to proximity fuses, which needed no external targeting data. General George Patton's Third Army received proximity-fused ammunition on December 22. The very next day, near Ector in Luxembourg, his artillery caught a German battalion attempting to cross the Sauer River. Patton's artillery, using the funny fuses, killed 702 enemy soldiers by actual body count. The German battalion ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Patton wrote that the new shell was devastating and suggested that when all armies got it, a new method of warfare would be necessary. German soldiers captured after the strikes described the attacks in terms of shock and complete helplessness. They exploded overhead with no warning, raining fragments straight down. Men in foxholes and trenches previously protected from ground-burst artillery now died as steel fragments came from above. German commanders had no tactical response. German offensive momentum ground to a halt by December 25, turning the counter-offensive into a catastrophic defeat. 417 German planes fell to proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire during the Battle of the Bulge period. The port of Antwerp, essential for Allied logistics, also benefited dramatically. It was under concentrated V-1 flying bomb attacks. These primitive cruise missiles flew fast and low, making interception extremely difficult with conventional weapons. When proximity fuses became available for the anti-aircraft batteries defending Antwerp, the equation changed overnight. The success rate against V-1s climbed to nearly 80%. The vital supply port remained operational, enabling the Allied advance. Similarly, American proximity fuses rushed to Britain transformed the defense of London with anti-aircraft batteries, destroying 79% of all incoming V-1s by the end of August 1944. In the Pacific theater, the proximity fuse's importance grew even greater as Japanese tactics evolved into organized kamikaze attacks. By October 1944, Japan had lost most of its experienced pilots. The kamikaze units used aircraft as guided missiles piloted by men who accepted death as the starting point of their mission. Naval commanders immediately recognized that proximity fuses would be critical against this new threat. Ships heading to the Pacific received priority allocation of proximity-fused shells. Proximity fuses proved uniquely effective against kamikazes because the suicidal nature of the attacks meant Japanese pilots flew predictable straight-line trajectories directly toward their targets with no evasive maneuvers. This predictability played directly to the proximity fuze strengths. 5 guns firing VT ammunition required only 310 rounds per kill against kamikaze attackers compared to 624 rounds per kill against conventional attacks. The Battle of Okinawa from April to June 1945 became the ultimate test. Nearly 2,000 kamikaze sorties attacked the Allied fleet. American naval forces suffered the highest casualties of any Pacific campaign. 26 ships were sunk and 164 damaged. But without proximity fuses, the losses would have been catastrophic. Nearly 23 of all VT fuses expended during the entire war were used in just 7 and 1/2 months of 1945, most of them around Okinawa. Those fuses shot down over 2,000 Japanese aircraft that otherwise might have crashed into American ships. Post-war analysis concluded definitively that proximity-fused shells were 3 to 4 times more effective than time-fuse ammunition against kamikaze attacks. The advantage was even more pronounced, with some engagements showing 5 to 10 times greater effectiveness. The proximity fuse also provided a psychological advantage, filling the sky with air-burst explosions that seemed to track their movements with uncanny accuracy. The project also validated a revolutionary model of military research and development. The collaboration between academic researchers at Johns Hopkins, industrial manufacturers like Crossley and Sylvania, and military planners produced a war-winning weapon in under 3 years. The proximity fuse program represents one of the greatest production miracles of World War II. At its peak in early 1945, over 110 factories operated by 87 different companies participated in production. This vast network employed over 100,000 workers, most of whom had no idea what they were building. Crossley Corporation received the first production contract in August 1942. Paulwell Crossley Jr. converted his entire factory to fuse production within weeks. Security was extraordinary. Workers thought they were making improved radio tubes. Crossley's plant became a model for mass production efficiency, producing 16,500 fuses every 24 hours at the program's peak in April 1945. Sylvania Electric Products became the backbone of tube production. Their plant manufactured approximately 1 million tubes every 212 days at peak production. By war's end, American industry had produced 22 million proximity fuses at a cost exceeding $1 billion. The cost per fuse dropped dramatically from an early hand-assembled price of $732 to $18 by 1945. The secrecy surrounding the proximity fuse held remarkably well. Despite millions of fuses being fired in combat, the Axis powers never successfully reverse-engineered the technology. German engineers captured some dud shells, but assumed the functional radio equipment inside an artillery shell was an elaborate deception or a failure. The Japanese understood the basic principle, but lacked the industrial capability to replicate the extreme miniaturization required. Secretary of the Navy James Festall stated that the proximity fuse helped blaze the trail to Japan. General Eisenhower wrote in his memoirs that if the Germans had perfected and used proximity fuses 6 months earlier than the Allies, the invasion of Europe would have proven exceedingly difficult, perhaps impossible. These were strategic assessments from the highest levels of military command. The proximity fuse saved countless lives. Naval historians estimate that without it, American casualties in the Pacific would have been 30 to 50% higher. The Battle of the Bulge might have succeeded in splitting Allied armies. The war might have continued into 1946 or 1947. The proximity fuse proved that small technological advantages properly exploited could determine the outcome of entire campaigns. The legacy of the proximity fuse extends far beyond World War II. Every modern anti-aircraft missile uses proximity fusing as standard equipment. 22 million tiny radars, each no larger than an ice cream cone, helped win the largest war in human